All right, so we've now got some data showing up in a nice formatted way in our table. However, if we jump back over to our controller, I will remind you that though we have this data here, it's just really hard-coded data right here, right? And we haven't really started implementing proper CRUD functionality. And by that, I mean like, a database. So now I get to show you how to do this. So let's see here. First off, let me open back up the File Explorer pane or whatever this thing is called, the project pane here. Let me make that a little better sized. Okay, there we go. All right. So if I minimize a few things here, I want to kind of show you the structure that I've kind of been driving towards. So we've got web things that relate to our presentation layer under the web package, although right now IntelliJ is kind of grouping up the controller under the web. And you know what? I just realized we're missing the formatter. You know what? I think I put the format. Yeah, I did. I put that under controller. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. It doesn't matter really, but I didn't mean to do that. Let me change that real quick. Okay, so we've got our presentation stuff under web, and then we've got our business logic stuff under .biz. And again, it's kind of just concatenating the biz and the model because right now model is the only package that we have under the biz package. Okay, so it's just putting those together. And now we're going to introduce the third part of our three-tier architecture, and that is the data, right? So I'm going to introduce another package here and just call it data. Now I'm going to remind you again, in real life, I've never actually created package structures that were this explicitly named with web, data, and biz. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's just not a typical thing that I will have ever done, nor have I seen it really done on teams. I'm really just doing this for you so that you can more easily see that web-related code goes under the web package, business data related or business logic related code goes under biz, and now the data related code will go under data. That's the only reason I'm doing this, just to make it a little more clear to you about those delineations of where the code belongs. And believe me when I tell you that I've worked with developers who've been at it for long time, 10 years, 20 years or whatever, who I'm convinced still don't have any idea about three-tier architecture or architecture of any kind for that matter, and have little to no concept of where code does belong and does not belong, okay? And so again, that's why I'm being fairly explicit with you, okay? By the way, this isn't a bad thing to do. It's just not something I've ever seen people typically do. I'm sure somebody somewhere in the world does this though. All right, but I don't want to give you the impression that this is a standard to name your packages this way. It is a standard to keep your code in the right places, but not necessarily quite this explicitly named in terms of web, data, and business logic or something like that. Okay, so what we are going to make here under data is a repository, all right? But so we've played with repository pattern a little bit now, but now we're going to do it using the Spring Data framework. And this will be somewhat familiar and totally alien to you at the same time. So just watch what I'm going to do here. So under the data package, I'm going to make a new Java class. And this will be a repository for the person class. Okay, so I'm going to call it person repository. However, I'm about to go in a different direction from what you're used to already. Rather than creating a class, I'm actually going to create an interface. And by the way, you may have noticed this little get message popping up. You're probably not getting that, and don't worry about it. This is just for me. I've decided for this module that I will attempt to track all of my changes per each lesson. So that way, when you guys, if and when you guys want to go into GitHub and see the code that I was writing, you'd actually be able to follow along from each lesson, like the way the code looked at the end of each lesson, rather than what I've been putting into GitHub up until now, which is kind of like the final way that it looks because I wasn't tracking each of my individual changes, okay? So you can ignore this little Git message that keeps popping up, but whenever I create a new file, the IDE is asking me, hey, do you want me to track this new file for Git? So yes, I'm doing that, but you can ignore that. Okay, so I've got this new interface for a person repository, and I'm going to have it extend an interface that comes with Spring Data, which is CRUD repository. And I bet that looks kind of familiar, doesn't it? Now, this is a generic interface, and so I can actually pass in two generic types. The first will be the type of the domain model class that I want this repository to be responsible for or work with, and that would be our person class. The other type, though, which I will separate with a comma, I might as well go ahead and import that person class now. The second type will be the data type of the ID property of the person class, okay? So that would be, in my case, long. Okay. And then I need to annotate this interface so that when Spring is starting up, or in this case, Spring Data is starting up, it can scan through all of the classes that I have here, and it will find this interface and know that it should treat this interface as an actual data repository, okay? And then it'll do all kinds of magic for me. So to do that, I will use another annotation of the Spring framework, which is @repository, like so. Now, guess what? That's all I have to do to make a repository with full CRUD capabilities. I really am not writing any actual code, not any real implementation code. I get a bunch of functionality for free just by doing this. And that's why I've been eluding all along that the Spring Data framework is kind of magic. All right. Now, that's not enough to make all of this work, though. I need to go into the person class now, and I need to make a few little alterations here. Now, do you remember in section 12, we created a custom interface that allowed us to flag which property was our ID property? You remember doing that? Well, the Spring Data framework has a similar capability, and actually it has somewhat of a necessity. In fact, we have to flag which property is being used for our IDs in this framework. So we will do it pretty much the same way that we did in section 12, because I essentially was inspired by the way that Spring Data works, okay? So we will use an @ID annotation, and I will import this annotation from the javax.persistence framework, okay? All right, now I also, though, will add one more annotation to this ID field, and that is an annotation so that I can tell Spring Data that I want the IDs to be generated in the database. So another thing that we won't have to do now that we are using Spring Data in this way is we will not actually have to define and create the tables in the database. Spring Data, working in conjunction with an underlying framework, which is called Hibernate, which actually does all the real work in this case, those two frameworks will work together to actually analyze the Java class here and translate that Java class into DDL, database definition language commands, to create tables for any classes that we want to be able to utilize with the Spring Data framework, okay? So basically, it's going to analyze this class and see that we've got an ID field of type long, and it will translate that into an integer or something like that. And it'll translate the first name field into a varchar with a default length of probably 255 or something like that. And it'll also name the columns based on these names, okay? Now we can override all of those default behaviors, but if we don't override anything, it'll use very sensible default values, okay? But we do want the database to generate these IDs for us, just as we did back in section 12. I don't know if you remember, but when we were creating our people table, we specified that we wanted the ID column to be a primary key and to be, I forgot what the term, auto numbered or something like that. Okay, so we can do something equivalent here, but in Java code. And the way to do that is with an @generated value annotation, like so. And that's all we need there. And then one more thing that we'll need now. In order to let Spring Data know that this class, the person class, should be one of the classes that we'll be using with Spring Data and Hibernate, the underlying framework that actually does all the talking to the database, really, we need to annotate this class. So just as we annotated our repository class with an @repository annotation, we need to annotate this class with an @entity annotation, again, coming from the javax.persistence package. All right, now as soon as I did that, I got red squiggly under the class name here. And the reason is because it's complaining that, hey, entities are required to have a public or protected no-arg constructor. Now, some of you who are very astute may be thinking, okay, so it's saying that you need to have a no-arg constructor, but Terry, didn't you say that when you put this Lombok @data annotation on a class, one of the things that you get is a default no-arg constructor? And those of you who thought that would be correct. Yes, I did say that when you use the @data annotation, you get a no-arg default constructor from Lombok. It will generate it. However, when we decided to programmatically create a list of people, I'll show you that real quick in the controller, right here, I wanted a constructor that would allow us to specify all the properties in the constructor, okay? And to get that capability, I added in the all args constructor from Lombok. And as soon as I did that, that overrode the no arg default constructor functionality from Lombok. So now if I want both an all args constructor and a no arg constructor, I have to explicitly say that. Okay, so now I can put in a no args constructor annotation as well. And now I get both a no arg constructor and the all args constructor. And now that little red squiggly went away. Okay, so that's just how Lombok is working. Okay, so we're all good with that. Now let's jump over to that controller again. So now that we've got database stuff set up, more or less, we don't need to be hard coding these people in the controller such that every time a request comes in to this controller, we end up creating all these people brand new and sticking them into this model. We don't have to be doing this now in this controller method. We could just put all of this data into the database once, ideally, and every time a request comes in, we could just query the database to give us all of the people and then put all of those people into the model. So the main thing that I'm saying that we'll do differently, perhaps, is we don't have to create this list explicitly every time we have a request come in, as we're doing now. We can put all of this into the database and then just query the database for it, okay? However, we need a way to get this data into the database quickly and easily. And there are a couple of ways to do that. We're gonna do what I think will be the easiest way first, and maybe only. And I think the second way I will only talk about, but I don't think I'm going to do it, okay? So what I'm going to do is, I think I'm gonna copy all of this code right here where we're creating this list. Just gonna copy all of that. Then I'm gonna open back up the project pane. And I think I'm going to create another class under the data package, okay? So I'm gonna highlight data, new Java package, and I'm gonna call this person data loader, okay? Now this will be an actual class. Enter, and sure, I will add that. And then let me close that pane there. All right, now this class, I'm going to have it implement another special interface of the Spring framework. So I'm going to say implements, and this will be application runner. All right, and I'm getting red squigglies because it's an interface and I need to implement a method or two of it. And I think it only has one method that we have to implement, and that is the one right there, run, okay? All right, so now all the red marks went away. Now let me tell you what an application runner is. A class that is implementing the Spring application runner interface will be called by the Spring framework whenever your application starts up. Now it won't get called immediately as soon as the application starts up, but real soon after that, because Spring needs to do a lot of setting up of a lot of things, okay? But when Spring is done doing all of its setup stuff, it will then immediately call any classes that you register with it as an application runner. And that will give us an opportunity to do some setup type things, okay? And the setup thing that I want to do here is to load our people data into the database if that data isn't already there, okay? So this is going to allow us to do that. So the way we will do this is a couple of things. First off, we're going to make a field on this class, and the field that we're going to put here is going to be a reference to our person repository. Okay, so we're going to make a private person repository field, and we'll just call it person repository, like so. Then we will make a constructor. I will let the IDE generate the constructor for us. So I did a command in here, constructor, and it's saying, hey, do you want to have this constructor depend on an instance of the person repository? And yes, I do want that. And I'll tell you why in just a moment. All right, so there's our person repository. Now, the reason I want this constructor here is because when Spring sees a class like this, which I want to register with Spring, Spring will see this constructor here, and it will see that this constructor requires an instance of a person repository to be passed in. And Spring will check its own internal registry of beans. Remember I mentioned about beans, I think, in the last lesson. So all of the interesting classes that Spring has to manage and maintain, which are generally called beans, Spring maintains a collection of all those beans internally, okay? And so when one bean says that it requires an instance of another bean, Spring will say, oh, I have an instance of a person repository in my registry. Why don't I inject an instance of the person repository into your class here? And so Spring will actually give us an instance of this person repository. Remember, I also mentioned in section 12, I think in the last lesson, in fact, that when we started using Spring, you would see that you rarely will use the new operator to create a lot of things. Now, of course, we're going to use it to create the people instances, but those people instances are not maintained or managed by Spring. But any classes that are managed or maintained by the Spring framework, you generally won't be creating new instances of those in most cases. There's one case that I can think of where you might sometimes do it, but I don't even know that we will need to do that in this entire section. All right, so anyway, that's what this constructor is here for. It's basically to kind of tell Spring, hey, I want you to give me an instance of your person repository after you've made one, okay? That's me talking to Spring. All right, so then down here in the run method, this is where you get to do whatever you want once Spring is done starting up, essentially. So what I'm going to do down here is paste all of this person stuff right here, okay? So we've got this collection of people that we were creating, all right? And then what I'm going to do right after we've created that collection or that list, I'm going to reference the person repository, and I'm going to call a method on it, save all. So it's got this method, save all, that takes something of type iterable. And let's see what happens here if I reference people. Look at that. So our people variable is a list of people, and the list interface is also iterable. If we jump into the list interface itself, we see that it extends collection. And then if we jump into collection, look at that, collection extends iterable, okay? So that just means something that can be iterated over or counted over or looped over or whatever, okay? So lists are iterable, okay? Let me close that. And that is why we can pass our list of people into the save all method here, okay? The save all method that we didn't have to write or implement, we're just getting it for free. Okay. Some of you may very well be wondering, by the way, let's see here. If we jump into the person repository here, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. I meant to go here. Yeah. How is it that this will even work since there's just an interface here? I'm not going to go real deep. I'll just say this. So what the Spring Framework will do in this case is it will dynamically create an implementation of this interface at runtime, meaning when the application actually starts up, the Spring Data Framework will introspect what we are wanting to do with this interface. It will see all of the inherited methods here, and it will create implementations of all of those standard methods. So a little bit kind of like what we did in our section 12 CRUD repository, except we wrote all of our implementation code before we were running the application, but it is possible in Java to dynamically write code programmatically if you really know what you're doing, and then have that code actually like usable, okay? And so the Spring Data Framework actually does that, okay? It actually writes the code from templates, basically, from boilerplate templates that it kind of has, but it actually writes the implementation code for us in real time. Okay, so I think that's about as deep as I want to go into that in this course. All right, so that would save all of our people right there. Now, a couple other things that we're going to want to do, though. We won't want to be passing in these IDs because they're going to be generated for us. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to shift into the column selection mode so that I can select just columns right here, just like that. Remember that? And I'm going to replace all of this with null. And then I'm going to hit escape. And then I will get out of column selection mode by just doing a Shift Command 8 again. All right. So now all of those will be null, which will let Spring JPA and Hibernate know that the database should be responsible for filling these in and not us. Okay. That's what that will do. And let's see, what else do I want to do? Oh, yeah. And then the other thing I would like to do is to make the saving of this data conditional, okay? So I don't want to do this if I have any records already in the database. This is just like if you are first starting up the application and you don't have any people records in the database at all, then go ahead and initialize the database with some data that first time, okay? So a way that we could do that, and actually, I mean, I guess we could go ahead and just protect all of this from even running, okay? So one way that we could do that is we can do an Option Command T to surround this with an if block, like so. And then I'm thinking we can call person repository dot count, and we can say something like if the count equals 0. Then do all of this. So in other words, if there are already records in the person table, then don't do any of this, right? Because we don't need the help at that point. All right. So really, this bit of code here should only run the one time, in essence. All right. So now let's jump back over to the controller. And we should be able to get rid of that. Now, I know that that's red, and we will take care of that in just a moment. But we're getting rid of that bit there. Now, I think I'm going to actually introduce you to another little bit of functionality of the Spring Framework now. So what we're going to do is we're going to introduce one more method here. Now, we don't have to do this, but I just kind of want to show you a little bit more of the Spring Framework's functionality. All right, so actually, first thing we'll do is let's rename this method slightly. So I'm going to do a Shift F6, and we're going to rename this method to show people page. Let's do that, okay? That's step one, and you'll see why I'm doing that in just a moment. Then here, we're going to make a new method. It's going to be public, and it's going to return an iterable of person class, okay? And then I will import the person class again. And now this will be called get people, like so, okay? And then we're going to make a private field of the people controller class of type person control, of type person repository, just like we did in our application runner. And Also, just as we did in the application runner, we will go ahead and create a constructor here that will take that instance of the person repository. So in other words, I want this controller to depend on the person repository, okay? Also, so that down here, we can do this, return person repository dot find all. And that will find all of the records that are in the person table or people table. All right. Now, one last thing we need to do here is put an annotation on here. So we're going to use an annotation, model attribute. And we will pass in a name of people, like so. Then down here, now we can get rid of this model attribute and just return the name people. So we're going to run this real quick, and then I will explain everything in a little bit more detail. And I think, let's see here. Maybe one more thing we want to do is jump back over to the data loader. And I don't know, let's change a few names just so that we make sure that something actually changed here, okay? So let's make Pete and Jennifer and Mark, and let's put some different countries' names in here. Vishnu McGuire. That's an interesting combination of name. And I don't know, Alice and Akira. That's an interesting combination too. A Japanese first name and a Korean last name. All right. So I just wanted some different data here. Okay. So let's restart the application and see if I broke anything. Interesting. Okay. Getting nothing back. All right. Let's see why. So let's jump back over to the controller. Oh, and I already know, and I know what I forgot to do. We're going to jump back over to the data loader. And I kept thinking, yeah, I need to do this, but I want to hold off on it until I'm done. And then by the time I was done doing everything else in here, I totally forgot about it. So we need one last thing in here, which is we need to put an annotation up here, and we'll just put an at component annotation so that, again, when the Spring framework is starting up and it's scanning through all the classes looking for interesting classes, it will see that this is one of the classes that it should consider to be interesting because it has this at component annotation on it, okay? So without that, Spring will just ignore this, this class, okay? All right, there we go. I think that took a second to load up, though. I got a little confused with what I was seeing there, but there we go. We've got our data there now, okay? So yeah, we needed to just register this data loader as a component, okay? And in fact, if I restart again, we shouldn't see additional records here because this code should not run again. So let me restart that. Okay, cool. So yeah, so now our data is actually coming from the database itself. Now, another thing you may be wondering is, Terry, we didn't see you set up any JDBC URL or point to a database or any of that kind of stuff. How is there a database, and how can you prove that there's a database here at all? Great question. So Spring Boot, the whole entire framework is kind of magical, okay? And one of the things that the Spring Boot framework tries to do is that it tries to favor convention over configuration. And what that means is it tries to figure out what your intent is or what you're intending to do with your code without you having to explicitly configure every single thing all the time, okay? So in our case, Spring Boot, when it is starting up with Spring, it sees that we have imported the H2 database library into our project. Let me just remind you of that. If we go into our build.gradle file here, we specified that one of our dependencies should be the H2 database right there, okay? And so right away, Spring Boot knows, okay, he has imported the H2 database. And this is me talking like Spring Boot for a minute. Spring Boot says, I know that the H2 database is often used as a quick way to just get some code working with some kind of database. And oftentimes just a simple in-memory database, in fact, okay? So Spring Boot says, if I find the H2 database library as a dependency in the class path of this project, and if I don't see any explicit configuration anywhere where the developer has told me where to connect to and how to connect, I will assume that I should just make a very simple default database instance and connect to that and make that connection available to everything that I control that has anything at all to do with databases, like our repository. So without me having to configure anything at all, I get a connection to a default in-memory database right off the bat. Now, in-memory database, that's something that I didn't show you in section 12. But H2 has the ability to store its database in memory instead of in a file. Now, the reason we didn't play with that functionality in section 12 was because in order to make use of an in-memory database, you'd have to also have code that is explicitly creating all your tables and the structures within the database, presumably every single time the application starts up. And I didn't want us to have to write all of that code as well, where we're spitting out DDL and then populating all the data. And it also means with an in-memory database that every time your application stops and then restarts, you no longer have any data, okay? So it's great for quick little things like what we're doing here, but it's not as good if you're trying to make like a real application, okay? But by default, that's what we're using right now. It's just an easy in-memory database from H2, and Spring Boot did all of that for us. And that's one of the tricks that Spring Boot can do that the regular Spring framework would not do. The regular Spring framework doesn't assume any of those kinds of things. You have to explicitly configure everything. Spring Boot says, I want you to be able to be highly productive with minimal configuration, and you shouldn't be forced to configure anything until you actually need to, okay? All right, so last thing I want to do now, because I promised I would do this and I was almost about to forget again, is to just walk through a little bit more of what's going on in this program now. So let me go back over to the controller. Mostly, I mean, look at what's happening in the controller here. All right, so let's see here. Let me explain a few things now that I don't think I explained explicitly before, starting at the top here. So we're marking our people controller as a controller, and now I think you may understand that this at controller is similar to the at component and the at repository. It's just telling Spring, hey, here's an interesting class that I want you to register and manage, okay? So, and specifically though, if it's controller, then that means it has to do with web stuff, okay? The next annotation, request mapping people. This is telling Spring MVC that in general, any requests that come into this application from the web with the resource of /people should be mapped to this class, this people controller. So I could have other controllers that map to other resources, okay? So I could have a controller that maps to /cars or /homes or whatever, okay? And so in the browser, if I want my requests to be handled by this class, which is annotated with this request mapping /people, then I have to put a /people in the URL here in order for those requests to come here, okay? So that's what this is doing. This is saying, hey, I will answer any requests that are directed to /people, okay? All right, let's see. Then here's our interface. The Spring framework will inject any instance of this type person repository that it knows about into this class automatically. Now, you may see a lot of code on the internet that looks like this, auto-wired, okay? This is superfluous, but it will work. This tells Spring explicitly, hey, Spring, go find any instances of type person repository that you happen to be managing and inject them into this constructor. That's what this means. But even without this, Spring's default behavior these days is to go ahead and perform that injection anyway if you have a constructor that has a data type that it knows about, and if that's the only constructor you have there, okay? Alternatively, I also could have done an @AutoWired like this, and then I actually could have even gotten rid of this constructor here, and this would still work. In this case, Spring would use some fancy trickery and force an instance of the person repository directly into this field because I have this auto-wired annotation here. And we did a little bit of this trickery ourselves in section 12 when we were populating the ID fields of our person class using our own framework. You can go back and look at that if you don't know what I'm talking about, but that was the way that we were able to populate the ID field of an instance of a person. We used the reflection API and forced the values into that field. That's essentially what Spring is doing if you use the auto-wired annotation in this way. But again, we don't need this. We can just create a constructor and have Spring do it this way. Now, what's the difference between these two approaches? Well, functionally, they're the same, but conceptually, there is a difference. And that conception is the fact that, in fact, let me uncomment that, and I'm going to get rid of this. Conceptually, the difference is the fact that when we say that our people controller has a constructor that requires this instance of person repository, we're really saying that you shouldn't be allowed to even create an instance of a controller without having a person repository. Okay, so it's a conceptual thing. I don't want controllers to exist, or I don't want the people controller to exist unless I have a valid repository, okay, person repository for it, okay? So I'm just more tightly establishing the dependency relationship between a people controller and the person repository. Whereas if I did not do it this way and I just put the auto-wired up here and I told Spring that, hey, you're allowed to inject a person repository in here, that would mean that it is valid to create an instance of a people controller, even if something maybe kind of went a little bit wrong with the person repository or something like that. Although I think actually Spring would still complain if it tried to create a person repository and it couldn't because like there was no valid database or something like that. But conceptually, this is what I mean here. All right. Now this bit here, get people. So I'm going to skip over this for just a second and I'm going to address this a little bit more, and then this will make more sense in relation. Okay, so this get mapping here annotation relates to those core HTTP operations that I talked about earlier, like the get and post, and there are some others. There's put and delete and things of that sort, but the main two ones that you'll see most often in many cases, especially for web applications, are get or post, okay? So what this is saying is, if a request comes addressed for the /people resource, and that request is a get request, okay, meaning using the HTTP get verb or get operation, let this method here handle that request. So this method would be called when we do something like localhost 8080/people. This is the method that's going to get called, okay? Now, the return type of string, what this is saying is it should respond by showing a view called people. Now, the view for people is going to relate to, and you can probably guess, our template over here called people.html. So by default, whatever string we return from these handler methods, if you want to call it that, because it's handling the request that came in, whatever string we return from here will try to be matched up with a template over here in the templates folder. Okay, that is the default behavior of Spring MVC. And let me also mention now, Spring MVC, the MVC in Spring MVC actually stands for Model View Controller. That is a standard design pattern that, again, is one of these patterns that has kind of been evolved over years by really smart developers who realize that whenever you're working with graphical user interfaces, it's often a good idea to have something called a model where you can put your data in, and then you can pass that model onto the view, where the view can then extract data out of that model and then use it to present information to a user on a screen. And you'll have something called a controller, which controls all of that interaction essentially. Okay. So Spring MVC. So we've got our controller here. We've got our model here and now here as well. And then we've got our view, which is this thing here, which relates to this HTML file over here, this template file, okay? So by returning the string people, we are telling Spring MVC, hey, when you're done running this method on your way out the door, go load up this template over here, and then take whatever data was put into the model and use that data to fill in your template, okay? Now, the last thing I want to talk about is this method here. When you have a method that is annotated in Spring MVC with this @model attribute annotation, that method will actually run before this handler method here, okay? And so what's going to happen, let me make some room again. And so what's going to happen is first, this method is going to get called by Spring MVC before this method does. Oh, and sorry, I put a little debugging stuff in here when I was trying to understand why this wasn't working. So let me delete that. Now I don't need that. Okay. All right. So this will get called first. And in this particular case, whatever comes out of this method, which would be an iterable of people, whatever comes out of this method will automatically be stored in the model, just like we were doing originally. It'll get stored in the model, and it'll be stored in that model with this key of people. Okay, so this is really just another way of doing what we had before when we were doing, model.add attribute people, comma, and then in fact, I could even do it this way. I could even do that. So that is calling this. Now, of course, if I were going to do this, then I should really get rid of this attribute here because that would be ambiguous if I didn't. All right. But this is equivalent to this. Okay. Now, why would you want one or the other? Well, the real reason I introduced this to you was just to show you another way of doing this so that I can teach you a little bit more about Spring and Spring MVC. However, oftentimes you'll have pages that have a lot of like reference data that needs to be filled in, like drop-down options on a page or things like that. And if those options are coming from a database, for example, then you might want to just have a model attribute annotated method for each of those options. There's a lot of ways you could do that, or even just one method that grabs all of it, although I think that would be a little worse to do, something like that. So that's just another way that you could do all of this and separate those kinds of fields and dynamic data from the heart of whatever it is that you're wanting to do with your handler method, okay? So I'm going to delete this. And one more thing now. Since I now have this model attribute annotated method here, I actually do not need this anymore because the only reason that was there was so that I could do the equivalent of this, and now I don't need that. So if I restart, yeah, everything still works. I haven't broken anything. And now this get mapping is really, really lean and lightweight, not doing anything because really all of the big stuff is happening up here now, okay? All right, so I think that is more than enough to explain for now. So we'll flesh out some more cool functionality in the next lesson. So I will see you there. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this content and you'd like to help me out, there are several ways you could do that. First, you can always click the like and subscribe. That'll help me out a lot. Additionally, another way you can help me out is to check the link in the description below. That'll link you to my website where you can find additional courses. And finally, for those of you who might be interested in starting a new career as a professional software developer, I offer a free PDF guide that will detail exactly how you can get started in this field with no college degree and no prior experience. All you need to do is click on the link in the description below. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next one.